Hello and welcome back. If you'll recall, in the last video, we had ended up by changing that get possible moves method on the pawn to return an enumeration instead of just a single move. And what I'm going to do now here is actually kind of flounder around a little bit. So instead of cutting this out, I will take the opportunity to apologize that it's been a little while since my last installment in this series. I was recording a Pluralsight video, which I had just finished up, so that was taking a lot of my spare time. But I am back in action with this series, and hopefully now momentarily done floundering around in the actual video. What I'm doing here is I wasn't sure quite how to proceed, but I saw that the get piece method in board was taking two int parameters again, which is not what I want. This is the primitive obsession code smell we talked about last time, so we want to replace this with a type. So this is an easy enough test to get failing. Instead of necessarily writing a new test every time I want something failing, it's entirely possible to use an existing test and just alter it. This keeps the amount of tests in your code base relatively lean compared to what you might need. And the reason I say that is because test code, just like any other code, is a maintenance liability. So if you have hundreds of thousands of tests in your code base, that's going to slow you down. So you don't want to have more tests than you need. If you can make a test better to get read, by all means go do that. And that's what I did. So I changed the functionality a little bit to look a little better. And now I'm going to move on. And one thing that I often do when I'm not quite sure where to go next is I'll start to toy a little bit with putting in guard conditions, preconditions, or maintaining invariance or something like that. So I ask myself, what happens if I pass in a board coordinate that doesn't make any sense? And what do I want to do in certain situations? So I think what I want to do is throw an exception. If I pass a coordinate into board that is bigger than the board size, that seems to make sense. It's a good way to make sure as a sanity check that we're proceeding in a good way. So I'm going to say that it's going to throw an exception when board coordinate has larger value than board size, meaning if I pass in some parameter to board coordinate, I think I can create any size of board coordinate that I want. And when I actually pass it to a board, that's when reality is going to hit. So I am going to use something that I use all the time here, which is a class I call extended assert. This helps me get around the fact that MS Test misses an explicit method, assert method that you can call to see about throwing an exception. There's this expected exception attribute you decorate the class with. I have never been a fan of that because that just says this exception gets thrown anywhere in the method. I want to be more specific than that, and I want to say this right here is exactly where I'm expecting the exception to be thrown. So I do this extra bit of legwork and I port this test in, or I should say assert in. I should really probably in this day and age have a NuGet package stored somewhere that I can just access this. But for expediency, I am using the copy and paste buffer and grabbing it from somewhere else. So what this is going to do is it's going to take a generic parameter that specifies the type of exception. And I'm going to pass in via lambda some method, in this case adding the inappropriate coordinate to the board. And it will pass. Oh, I'm going to flounder around for a minute forgetting that this method takes two parameters, and then after a while I'll remember that. So when I pass in this, it's going to fail because I'm not currently throwing an exception. And then I'll go make it pass. And one of the things I like about doing this is a momentary pause is it lets me move on. Test-driven development sort of forces a narrow focus. It forces me to pick a problem that I'm going to solve. And here's one I know I need to solve at some point. I need to be guarding against insane inputs. So maybe absent knowing exactly what else to do at the moment, I can take care of some housekeeping like this, and then it will actually let me perhaps brainstorm and think and get the creative juices flowing to figure out what I want to do next. Now, there's a bit of a naming problem here that I'd like to address. Throws exception when board coordinate has larger value, but it's actually a larger x value. And that's kind of given me a bit of inspiration here. So I'm going to start plotting along with more of this preconditioned validation, and it might bore you a little bit, but there's actually now a method to my madness with what I'm doing. So what I'm going to go in here and do is say, well, if we're going to validate the x coordinate, then by gosh, we need to validate the y coordinate as well. Sooner or later, we're going to have to do that, so it might as well be now. And what I'll take this opportunity to do is get functionality that I need in place. But as I'm doing it, I'll start to let the pain of what I'm doing guide me. And I found this to be an important technique. And what I mean by this, it's a little abstract, but if you start to do what I'm doing here, which is to add a bunch of preconditions, in essence, a bunch of different things to check in a growingly complex Boolean method, that should kind of tell you that maybe you can factor to a better design. So you can see where this is going as I fumble around with the typing. I'm going to have this failing test, and I'm going to come down here and I'm going to add a condition to this method here. And I'm going to say that otherwise, if the move target has an invalid y coordinate, then we're also going to throw this argument exception. And now I bet you can think of some other things to do, and I know I can think of one. So let's plot on up here back to the test class, I should say, and let's just keep going. So we'll say that it's going to throw an exception if there's a 0 value for the x coordinate, let's say. So then you can see what the next thing is that's going to happen, which is if move target.x is 0, also throw an exception. And so what the code is telling us, this is what I might describe as a test smell or a testing smell as you go along. We're kind of getting a little bit obtuse, and so that makes you want to scratch your head and say, okay, well, what are we really doing here? At the very least, probably once I get this test passing, it's time to think about pulling out a method, at the very least, and I actually have designs even above and beyond that, but let's get this failing test going, if I can type the right things in here. And then let's get it passing, because you never ever want to go about refactoring when you're in the red. So I'm going to add a condition here. And I'm going to say that if the move target is 0 for the x value, then we also want to be throwing an argument exception. Then I'm going to kind of look at this and say, all right, enough is enough. Let's see what this looks like if we pull it out into a method. We're getting a little silly here in this precondition. So let's give this a good name. And one thing I like to do is as soon as Booleans start getting even remotely complicated, my preference is to go and extract a method. So this is a perfect candidate. Let's give it a name that makes sense. And I'm going to call this, let's see, validate board coordinate. I'm not in love with that name, and I'm going to change it soon. And in fact, I've got the conditional logic here backwards, so I am going to use a trick of code rush, which is much better in my opinion, at least for me, than inverting Booleans for the sake of naming, which is I'm going to create this variable and then I'm going to go and use a cheat called reverse Boolean. Hey, there we go, and I'm going to re-inline this thing, and now I've flipped the Boolean around, so validate board coordinate is now doing the opposite thing, and what I should be doing is giving this a name, is coordinate not valid. I messed this up at the time. It will no doubt confuse me later as I go on through this video, but sometimes that's the kind of thing that happens. It's why Boolean logic can be tricky, and it's why giving things good names is important, even though I sort of belie that here. Usually I'll catch something like this right as I'm coding it. I think as I was writing this code, and you'll have to forgive me, it was over a week ago that I wrote this, but from what I recall, I was paying more attention to what I wanted to actually do with this method. So here's a hint. I'm going to do more refactoring, and is coordinate valid is not going to wind up in this class. That was a temporary place for it as I thought through my design. Now, there is this board coordinate class that we have access to. So I'm going to change the name a little bit here and use this concept of board size. And what this is going to let me do is go and place this in the actual board coordinate class where I feel this is a more appropriate place for it. So if I pass a board size into board coordinate, then I think that this method on board coordinate should be able to tell me whether or not I'm valid. It just seems to me like a more suitable place for this logic to live, since it's so intimately tied with the actual dimensions of the board coordinates. So if I say, if I want to know if a board coordinate's valid, the question then becomes, well, for what board size? So why not have that be logic that gets executed on the board coordinate, and I just tell the board coordinate what board size we're talking about. So all of this refactoring was done with this in mind, and I'm going to now, when I get past this board coordinate, as the board, I know what size I am, so I'm going to pass in my size, and then I'll see here if it's valid. And notice that all these tests are still passing. This is a refactoring technique and a test-driven development technique that I've gravitated towards over the years. Call it maybe a hybrid approach between outside-in test-driven development and sort of classic, or whatever you want to call it, test-driven development, where I do a little bit of integration here. I'm going to let these tests that I already have in place extend across two different classes as I grow the code. And why not have these slight integration tests in there? They make sense. They let me know that I'm on the right track. They let me know that my functionality is preserved. So I like the way this is going. Now that I've created logic here in this board coordinate class, what I'm going to do is when I want to change subsequent behaviors, now I'm going to drill into this and create a test class for it and do it there. But there's no sense throwing out the old test that I have. And for better or for worse, this is a style I've favored more recently when it comes to my test-driven development. So here's another thing I want to do. I was specific about 0, but if we pass in nonsense like a board coordinate with a negative value, we should also have this return false. This is not valid for this board size or really for any board size. So the fact that it's not equal to 0 isn't exactly helpful. I need to have something that says, if it's less than 0, that's no good. So I'm just going to make a quick change in here in order to get this to be passing. Oh, and this is the point at which I figure out the confusion in my backwards naming. Always, always, always do as I say here, not as I did. Naming is so important. Concentrate on it. Get it right immediately. As this is actually a good object lesson in naming, I stumble around here confused for a while because I didn't get the naming right 2 or 3 minutes ago. That mistake will compound so much over the lifetime of the time that it exists. So now I'm in here fixing it. Had I just fixed it right at the get-go, life would have been a lot easier for me. But now I'm kind of trying to figure out what's going on, and is this not this or that or what have you. That's confusing. So I'm in here making fixes, and eventually I promise I get this right. So is coordinate valid for board size 5? The answer should be no. What I was doing here was thinking I had messed up my logic somehow. I still have yet to correct the actual problem. And I'm even going to go so far as to debug this. If memory serves, was sort of embarrassed and debated cutting a lot of this out. But hey, everybody makes mistakes, such as life, often dumb ones. So this is why I do test-driven development. It really helps catch these dumb mistakes as early as humanly possible, even when it's staring you in the face and you can't seem to figure it out, which is frustrating. I think this was about at the point where I had an aha moment, if memory serves. I guess we'll see. But just getting these in front of you, hey, if nothing else, you don't test, these get caught by your peers at code review or by QA, or hopefully it doesn't get this far, but maybe in production. And can you imagine getting a bug kicked back from your code from production where it's something as simple as you have the wrong guard condition because of an inverted Boolean that you just forgot to give the method a reasonable name? That's pretty embarrassing. So why am I having all these problems? Simple naming. So I'm hoping for my own sake that I catch this here soon. Again, it's been too long since I did this. I don't remember exactly at what point I figured out what was going wrong here. But this looks promising. The cursor is now moving around with some sense of purpose, so I think that I can actually get this test failing the way that it should be, and pretty soon we'll have everything figured out. Hey, there it is. Now, after a lot of embarrassment, I probably just need to change the name. So this is an interesting point too. One of the saving graces here is that I caught something by forcing a test to go red first. So all of that rigmarole, what I was actually trying to do is figure out why the test was green when I expected it to be red. And that's a really important point when it comes to test-driven development. you should know what's going to make code fail, and you should also know what's going to make code pass. And if at either point, it's not just that, oh, I think it should be passing, but it fails, obviously that's bad, but I think this should fail and then it doesn't, that means you don't know what your code is doing, as I didn't here know what my code is doing. I just caught a mistake because I wouldn't let go of the fact that I thought that the test should go red when in fact it wasn't. So now I'm just kind of mopping up the mess from this rather embarrassing error. And I'm getting all the tests to pass. Now this looks like it makes a lot more sense. Is the coordinate valid? It's valid if it's greater than 0. It's valid if it's less than or equal to the board size. You know, now things are looking good. And you were probably watching all along thinking, you know, how ridiculous this mistake was that I was making. But it's kind of easy to get in blind alleys like that. And you will find that that happens a lot in your code. It's a lot easier if you're catching it quickly with sort of continuous feedback and a short feedback cycle the way you have with TDD. It gets a lot more frustrating at times to be catching it during runtime or something, have the application fired up and all that. So now I'm just doing the same thing for the Y value. And then I'm going to do a refactoring here. Now that I have some redundant logic in this conditional, so I have variable is greater than 0, variable is less than or equal to board size. I don't like duplication anywhere it exists, even in a situation that's this small. This is coordinate valid for board size method and has a problem in my opinion. It's doing the same thing twice. So while all my tests are green, I'm going to write this method here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in a dimension to it here. Once I figure out that I need to do that, there we go. And I'm just going to check that that dimension is greater than 0 and less than or equal to board size. And then I'm going to invoke it on both X and Y. This might seem sort of trivial, but if you do this routinely and consistently, it is a way to ruthlessly eliminate duplication from your code base. It's a discipline, and it's one that's served me incredibly well. So it might seem pretty nitpicky, but when you have something like this aggregated over an entire code base, it really makes a difference. And it's so easy to let slight instances of duplication go, and before you know it, you're surrounded by kind of a pile of crap. So this is something I wholeheartedly advocate. And I'm going to put in static just because CodeRush will complain about it otherwise. And I think that's probably a good place to stop for now.